Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. My name is Celine Nenda Febia from 5 BBEC, and I want to explain about my research journal, and the title is Sampling. Sample size equation that often plagues novice researchers is just how large their sample for research should be. There is no clear-cut answer for the correct sample size depends on the purpose of the study and the nature of the population under scrutiny. However, it's possible to give some advice on this matter. Generally speaking, the larger the sample, the better. It has not only give greater reliability but also enable more sophisticated statistics to be used. A commonly used test discussed in the part 5 with cross-tabulate data, for example, looking at the subgroup of stakeholders in a primary school containing 60 10-year-old pupils and a 20 teachers and their response to a question on the 5-point scale. Here one can notice that the sample size 80 cases in apparently reasonably sized sample. However, 6 of the 10 cells of response, 60%, contain fewer than 5 cases. The 6-squared statistic requires there to be a 5 cases or more in 80% of the cells. For example, a survey style usually requires a large sample, particularly if inferential statistics are to be calculated. In ethnographic or qualitative research, it is more likely that our sample size will be small. Sample size might also be constrained by the cost in terms of the time, money, stress, administrative support, the number of the research, and resources. Suggests that correlational research requires a sample size of no fewer than 30 cases, that casual comparative and experimental methodologies require a sample size of no fewer than 15 cases, and that survey research should have no fewer than 100 cases in each major subgroup and 20-50 in each minor subgroup. Qualitative data in qualitative study of 30 highly able girls of similar socio-economic background following an A-level biology course. A sample of 5 or 6 might novice a researcher who is prepared to obtain additional corroborative data by way of validation. And the next is quantitative data. For quantitative data, a precise sample number can be calculated according to level of accuracy and the level of probability that research and record and the work. They can report in the study the rationale and the basis of the research decision. By way example, suppose a teacher or researchers wish to sample opinions among 100 secondary school students. Sampling error if many samples are taken from the same population. It's unlikely that they will have a characteristic identical with each other or with the population. Their means will be different. In a brief, there will be sampling error. And the next is representativeness of the sample. The research will need to consider the extent to which it is important that the sample in effect represents the whole population in question. In the example above, the 1,000 students, if it's to be a valid sample, that research will need to be clear what is the data being represented. To set its parameter characteristic of the wider population, the sampling will frame clearly and correctly. There is a popular example of how poor sampling may be unrepresentative and unhelpful for a research. The access to the sample. Access is a key issue and is an early factor that must be decided in research. Researchers will need to ensure that access is not only permitted but also in fact practicable. For example, if a researcher were to conduct research into truancy and unauthorized absence from school and decide to interview a sample of truants, the research might never commence as the truants, by definition, would not be present. Similarly, Access to sensitive areas might be not only difficult but also problematical both legally and administratively. Access to child abuse victims, child abuse, disaffected student, drug addict, school reverse bullying, and victim of bullying. The sample strategy to be used. There are two main methods of sampling: cocaine and holidays. Decide whether to opt for a probability, also known as a random sample, or a non-probability sample. The next is stratified sampling. It involves dividing the population into homogeneous groups. Each group contains subjects with similar characteristics. For example, Group A may contain males and Group B females. In order to obtain a sample representative of the whole population in terms of sex, a random selection of subjects from Group A and Group B must be taken if needed. The exact proportion of males to females in the whole population can be reflected in the sample. The researchers will have to identify those characteristics of whether population which must be included in the sample. To identify the parameter of the wider population. And the next is cluster sampling. When the population is large and widely dispersed, gathering a simple random sample poses administrative problems. Suppose we want to community across a country, it would become completely impractical to select students random and spend an inordinate amount of time traveling about in order to do them. By cluster sampling, the researchers can select a specific number of schools and test all the students in those selected schools. One would have to be careful to ensure that cluster sampling does not build any bias. For example, let's imagine that we take a cluster sample of a city in an area of heavy industry or great poverty. This may not represent all kinds of city or socio-economic groups. There might be similarities within the sample that do not sketch variability of the wider population. And the next is stake sampling. Stake sampling is an extension of the cluster sampling. It involves selecting the sample in stake, that is taking sample from sample. Using the large community example in cluster sampling, one type of stake sampling might be to select a number of schools at random, and from within each of these schools, select a number of places at random, and from within those places, select a number of students. Provides an example of how to address stake sampling in practice. Let us say that the researchers want to administer a questionnaire to all 16 years old pupils of 11 secondary schools in one region. Okay, the next is a multi-phase sampling. In stake sampling, there is a single unifying purpose through the sampling. In the previous example, the purpose was to reach a particular group of students from a particular region. In the multi-phase, it involves purpose changes at each phase. For example, at the phase 1, a selection of the sample may be based on the criterion of geography. Students living in a particular region, phase 2 might be based on economic criterions, based on political criterions, and from areas with a traditional of support for a particular political party, and so on. And the next is a non-probability example. The selectivity which is built into a non-probability sample derives from the research targeting a particular group. In the whole knowledge that does not represent the wider population. It simply represents itself. This is frequently the case in small-scale research. For example, as with one or two schools, two or three groups of students, or a particular group of teachers, where not a team to generalize is a desire. This is frequently the case for some ethnographic research. The next is a confidence sampling. Confidence sampling, or as it's sometimes called, accidental or opportunity sampling, involves choosing the nearest individuals to serve as a response and continuing that process until the required sample size has been obtained, or those who happen to be available and accessible at the time. And the next is a quota sampling. Quota sampling has been described as the non-probability equivalent of stratified sampling. Like a stratified sample, a quota sample strives to represent significant characteristics of the wider population. Unlike stratified sampling, it set out to represent this in the proportion in which they can be found in the wider population. For example, suppose that the wider population were composed of 55% females and 45% males, then the sample would have to contain 55% females and 45% males. If the population of a school contained 80% of students up to and including the age of 16 and 20% of students aged 17 and over, then the sample would have to contain 80% of students up to age of 16 and 20% of students aged 16 above. Okay, and the next is a purposive sampling. In purposive sampling, often a feature qualitative researchers handpick the cases to be included in the sample on the basis of their judgment of their typically or possession of the particular characteristic being sought. In this way, they pull up a sample that is satisfactory to their specific needs. Other names such as the sample has been chosen for a specific purpose. For example, a group of principal and senior manager, a secondary school is chosen as the research is studying in the incidence of stress among senior manager group of the affected student has been chosen because they might indicate most distinctly the factor which contribute to student dissatisfaction. And one class of students has been selected to be treated throughout a week in order to report on the curricular and the pedagogic diet which is offered to them, so that other teachers in the school might compare their own teaching to that reported. And the next is a dimensional sampling. One way of reducing the problem of sample size in quota sampling is to opt for dimensional sampling. Dimensional sampling is a further refinement of quota sampling. It involves identifying various factors of interest in a population and obtaining at least one respondent of every combination of those factors. The next is snowball sampling. Snowball sampling researches identify a small number of individuals who have the characteristic in which they are interested. These people are then used as informant to identify or put the research in touch with others who qualify for inclusion, and this, in turn, identify yet other, hence the term snowball sampling. And the third is a volunteer sampling. Volunteer sampling in cases where access is difficult, the research may have to rely on volunteers. For example, personal friends or participants who reply to a newspaper at first month, or just who happen to be interested from a particular school or those attending course. And next is a theoretical sampling. This is a feature of grounded theory. In the grounded theory, is a sample size is is relatively immaterial as one works with the data that one has in the grounded theory would argue that the sample size could be infinitely large, or as a fallback position size could be infinitely large, or as a fallback position large enough to saturate the categories and issue, such the new data will not cause the theory that has been generated to modify it. Theoretical sampling requires the research to have sufficient data to be able to generate and ground the theory in the research content. However, defined to create a theoretical explanation of what is happening in the situation without having any data that do not fit the theory. Okay, and the last is planning a sampling strategy. There are several steps in planning the sampling strategy. One, decide whether you need a sample or whether it's possible to have the whole population. And the second is identify the population, its important feature, the sampling frame, and its size. Number 3 is identify the kind of sampling strategy you require, which variant of probability and non-probability sample you require. And the 4 is answer that access to sample is guaranteed. If not, be prepared to modify the sampling strategy. And the 5 is for probability sampling. Identify the confidence level and confidence intervals that you record. And is a conclusion. The conclusion is the message from this chapter is the same as for many of the other, that's every element of the research should not be arbitrary but plain and deliberate, and that as before the criterion of planning must be fitness for purpose. And that's it for me. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.